It's a great pleasure to be here this evening and to meet so many of you and to find the Argaman Institute which gets it, and to hear that from all accounts more and more people in Israel are getting it. And I think that is a tremendous antidote to the kind of despair that I find among so many people today, that it all seems so hopeless, that we are encountering this great tide of irrationality as well as hatred. And nevertheless, it's very important to plug into the fact that there are millions and millions of people who really do get it and who need to be further enlightened and further guided and further supported. And that's the kind of work that you are doing. And I'm very grateful and pleased to hear that you are here doing it. So a quick word about why I wrote this book and what it was trying to do. It seemed to me, looking at the response to the 7/7 atrocities, that what we were looking at, aghast, from October 7 onwards, really, because it started on October 7 in London, where the first demonstration started, exulting in the murder of Jews, before the bodies had even been, before people had stopped being killed. It seemed to me that what we were looking at, was that the response in the West represented the total eclipse of conscience, of justice, and of reason, rationality itself. And I realized, because I was already working on this book, that this was precisely the conclusion I had long come to about the West itself, that what the West had been doing to itself over many decades had totally eclipsed its own sense of justice, its own sense of conscience, and its own ability to reason, to use rationality. So a quick word about what I think happened in the West before I get on to what I think Israel and the Jewish people can contribute to this situation, to remedying this situation, I should say. So what happened in the West was broadly that the elites in the West, the professional, political, cultural, intellectual elites, decided that the West was born in the original sins of colonialism, imperialism, oppression and racism and all the rest of it. And consequently, a new society had to be made, and for that, an axe had to be taken to Western culture. And so what I wrote about from the late 1980s onwards was an attack upon the West's core values and the Western nation state. It was an attack on the scaffolding of the culture, an attack on education as the transmission of the culture. You couldn't transmit a culture that was basically evil. You had to transmit something completely different, something completely new. An attack on the traditional family, which for all its manifold faults and for all that we should be careful and respectful of people who live alternative lives, nevertheless, the traditional family remains still the best template for producing well-adjusted, well-motivated participants in the culture, in the next generation. And an attack on the very idea of the nation. The idea of the nation was considered bad. Why? Because this is how it went. The nation led to nationalism. Nationalism had created Hitler. In order to avoid another Hitler, you had to abandon the nation. It was as stupid as that, and remains as stupid as that. The particular nature of national identity, Western national identity, based on Western history, its historic traditions, its laws, its religion, the particularity was bad because it was particular. If you were a member of a Western nation, then other people who weren't members of that nation were at a disadvantage because, of course, the West was inherently oppressive. And consequently, you had to replace the Western nation by a kind of brotherhood of man template, liberal universalism. Liberal universalism would bring about a better world free of prejudice and war. Now, the attack on the core institutions meant an attack on the core values of the West, which meant the Bible was out. God was dead, and the individual became the center of the universe. What the individual thought and felt trumped any authority. This was supposed to be the road to individual freedom and fulfillment and happiness and social justice. But in practice, what happened over many decades was that the idea of personal responsibility, which was in traditional, biblically based morality, gave way to victim culture, the idea that people in self-designated victim groups were motivated by resentment, by grievance, and expected other people to remedy their situation and blamed others for their own disadvantage. The idea that one should attempt to defeat evil gave way because evil no longer existed. Evil was a religious term. There was no such thing as evil. It was simply a competing narrative. And so victory over evil gave way to negotiation and compromise, which in practice meant the surrender of victims to victimizers. There was no such thing as objective truth. Anyone who believed there was an absolute truth was an intellectual cretin with no education and no sophistication. There was no such thing, therefore, as right and wrong. Everything was simply a matter of opinion and feelings. What mattered was human rights dislocated from duty and responsibility. Human rights is a kind of free-floating body of law and principles constructed by individuals after the Second World War, arbitrated by courts and judges. Human rights were the new religion. They were to be the absolute expression of international conscience, morality, and all good things. But what that meant was that human rights, detached from obligation, became simply demands, and demands made by groups. And so human rights actually created division between groups. The idea of justice was extinguished in the victory of the strong over the weak. The fact that there was no such thing as truth, everything was a matter of opinion, opened the way to the belief in lies. And rationality took a dive as facts were pushed aside as merely a matter of opinion. Now, where did all that come from? Well, it's a long story, and I'm obviously speeding through all this. But basically, you can trace it back to the 18th century Enlightenment. You can trace it back to the Holocaust, which I think demoralized, in every sense of the word, the West, which understood or believed that it had created this thing. The Holocaust had happened not in some benighted backwater of the world, but at the very apex of high Western culture, modernity, science, art, music, literature. And I think the West said, we did this, and consequently became vulnerable to the idea that that society, that culture had to be replaced. And then all that came on the back of the decline of religion, which is, again, a story in itself, was happening from the middle of the 19th century, took much deeper root in Britain than anywhere else in the West. Britain is the most godless country in the West. Britain also was first into the Enlightenment and is the first out. And that was connected to its godlessness. And people from America may not quite understand or realize the extent to which there is a difference between America and Britain in this regard. So this all knocked away the scaffolding of the culture, the moral scaffolding. And, you know, the culture, without a scaffolding, the culture disintegrates. And the result of that has been that the West will no longer defend itself because, in the immortal words of John Lennon, which are uppermost in my mind, as I'm sure they are in yours, there is nothing to fight or die for. And of course, in this country, there is everything to fight and die for. So the West, led by Britain and Western Europe, in my view, formed over many decades, is basically going off the edge of the cultural cliff. And we can see this because of the rise of Islamization in the West. The Islamists are not stupid. They could see what was happening in the West better than the West could see itself. The Islamists understand the role of religion in the human psyche. They understand that without a religious base, a society is no longer has any understanding of what it is, and is certainly no longer going to defend itself. And they realized that the way was then open to them to move in to the vacuum created by the loss of identity and purpose in the West. And we can see in Britain this is now achieving critical mass. And we've also seen the inability of the West to resist the phenomenon of mass immigration for various reasons. But one of the reasons has been this idea that it is racist to turn away anybody, because it is racist to believe that you have a culture based on a particular national identity which is worth defending, and that has to be removed, and instead you must have a kind of brotherhood of man, mass immigration. And then we've seen this tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, this extraordinary tsunami of anti-Semitism, which defies belief in the nature and depth and scale of this thing that's happened to Jews across the West. And there are many reasons for that, which we can perhaps go into. I would just quickly list some of them. There is this innate Western guilt, I believe, over the Holocaust, so that it's very important to people in the West that the Jews cannot be victims, because if the Jews aren't victims, and if they're actually Nazis, then they're off the hook. The West is off the hook. There is the Trojan horse of Palestinianism, in which a narrative constructed entirely on the destruction of Israel and the genocidal hatred of the Jewish people has now become the stock in trade of liberals in the West, because Palestinianism has become their default cause, their poster cause of conscience. There's the influence of so many Muslims in the West, and there is the fact that the left in the West has been basically taken over by a form of Marxism. And there's the fact that Israel and the Jewish people, because they are so particular, stand in the way of universalism, which is the religion of the West. And as we know, anti-Semitism is a sign of a society in deep trouble. So in conclusion of this particular part of my remarks, I would say this, that we cannot understand the onslaught on Israel and the Jews unless we understand what the West has done to itself. And we can't understand what the West has done to itself unless we understand that at the root of that is its own onslaught on Judaism. So that's my analysis, and it's pretty unsparing. But nevertheless, I am incredibly optimistic, partly because I live in this crazy place now. And I would say that this is the Jewish moment. For both the Jewish people and the state of Israel, this moment of crisis for us, and it is obviously an immense crisis, it can also be seen as the Jewish moment in the world. It's a seismic moment in Jewish and world history, which I believe has the capacity to change both the Jewish world and the wider world for the better, if the opportunities are taken. Big if, but let me spell out why I think this is so. The West, as I've indicated, is going down. I believe that the Jewish people and the state of Israel can help save the West from going off the edge of the cliff. Instead of viewing the Jewish people as a baffling nuisance and viewing Israel as a source of regional and global uproar, both the West and the wider Jewish world should be encouraged to see both Israel and the Jewish people as a rescue remedy for a culture that's basically in the terminal ward. And I think I would suggest there are three reasons why I say this. The first is that Judaism is essential to Western civilization. The second is that the unique selling point of the Jewish people is cultural survival. We do cultural survival like nobody else has ever done cultural survival. And the third point is that Israel itself is demonstrating, and has demonstrated for the past terrible 21 months, key reasons why it will survive and thrive and become a power in the world, while as things stand, the West may not survive at all. So let me just explain those three different points. Why is Judaism essential to the West? Most people don't think about Judaism when they think of the West. They think of the Greeks. They think that Western values are civilized values and that they are kind of imprinted in our DNA. They think that Western values are universal values. Everybody basically subscribes to them. Just a few things get in the way of them being practiced. Well, I do believe that Western values are civilized values, and I also believe that civilized values came from the Hebrew Bible. What do I mean by civilized values? I mean things like respect for every human life, taking responsibility for your own actions, their consequences, compassion and kindness, putting other people first, justice and the rule of law, political freedom and civic equality. Now, these principles, which I think are dear to all of us in the West, or should be, both secular and religious, whatever creed we come from, they didn't come from the Greeks, and they're not part of our DNA. They're not universal. One only has to think of the cruelties of Chinese society, the barbarism of ancient Greece, or the core doctrine of submission in the Islamic world to realize these values are far from universal. They came from the Hebrew Bible. Judaism's moral codes, which were pioneering, revolutionary moral codes, promoted justice, individual dignity, and kindness. These and others lie at the heart of the West's signature principles of humane, orderly, and civilized behavior. If we are obsessed by the ancient Greeks, well, their political system embodied in the city-state was an end in itself. Power, for them, was a virtue. Philosophical principles were a system, and it was in the system that virtue resided. There was no concept of promoting the interests of all individuals, but by contrast, the principles of the Mosaic Code created community based on duty and responsibility, inner directed moral direction, and respect for every human being, because every human being was regarded as made in the image of God. Remove the image of God and you don't have respect for every human being. Whatever people in the West may say, whatever the secular people may say, of course we have respect for every human being, that's just civilized. Actually, they have imbibed the values that were put into the West by Christianity, but basically came from Judaism. They don't like to admit it because only imbeciles are religious, as we know. But nevertheless, that's where they came from. So much is obvious, or should be obvious, to anybody who thinks about the moral principles of Judaism. But what is less obvious, but what is even more striking, is that principles that were revolutionary in ancient Judaism have been essential to democracy as we know it. These principles, which were revolutionary when the ancient Israelites invented them, I would suggest there are two principles which I would say are particularly important. One was the idea of limited government, the fact that the king, the ruler of ancient Israel, was constrained. He was not to be considered the absolute ruler. The absolute ruler was the Almighty. And around the king, on his own level, were people called prophets and judges. So, okay, this was a doctrine, this was a council of perfection. There were many kings who were despotic and bad and so on, but that was the template. And that was revolutionary, the idea that, you know, it was desirable for the ruler to be constrained in his power over the people. That wasn't what was true of the ancient world at all. That was the first principle I would say was very important. The second principle, no less important, was the idea that law by which everybody was bound in the society had to be founded in the consent of the people. And that was in the Mosaic Code when Moses came down the mountain and said, "Here is the law to the Israelites. Do you agree? Will you do it?" And the people said, "Yes, we'll do it." That was revolutionary. And that principle meant that everyone was bound by the same law, so you had civic equality, equality of civil status, and that brought everybody together. It helped unite disparate tribes. Now, in the 18th century, when Britain's Puritans founded what became the constitutional monarchy of Britain, and founded, in effect, the essence of what was to become parliamentary democracy, those people in 18th century England drew explicitly upon the Hebrew Bible in providing these and other principles by which they wished to produce a situation in which the king and the church would be constrained by laws made by Parliament, which was elected by the people. They drew that from the Hebrew Bible, and they said so. And the same kind of people went to America and founded America on precisely the same principles, and just like in Britain, produced pamphlets and books and tracts and sermons, whatever, giving explicit credit to the Hebrew Bible for these principles. And so not only were these two principles very important, but most fundamentally, what was key to all this was the Jews' sense of themselves as a people, as a nation, not just as a country, which of course they weren't ever since they were removed when the Romans threw them out. But they were a self-conscious unit characterized by a very strong sense of shared culture and purpose, and crucially by a quality of civil status. So that was, the essence of what we now understand to be Western democracy, came from us. And then there was science. Now everybody knows that only clever people do science, and only secular people are clever, and only secular people are scientists. And the idea that religion has anything to do with science, and science has anything to do with religion, is simply for the birds. Okay, well, where do we get science from? Well, let's go back to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks explained the natural world by abstract principles. Socrates thought that empirical observation was a waste of time, and Plato advised his students to, quote, leave the starry heavens alone. Western science, by contrast, grew from the idea that the universe was rational. And that belief that the universe was rational was given to us by Bereshit, by the book of Genesis, which set out the revolutionary proposition that the universe had a rational creator. Without a purposeful, singular intelligence behind it, the universe could not have been rational, and there would have been therefore no place for reason in the world, and no truths or natural laws for reason to operate on through observation, analysis, and deduction to uncover, and that was science. Science is a Western thing. Okay, other civilizations certainly have had science, but they've all basically gone round in circles and hit a dead end, to mix my metaphors. It's only the West where science was this engine of progress which continues without end. Progress, science is that sort of science is a Western thing. Progress is a Western thing. Modernity is a Western thing. And without Christianity's base in Judaism, there would have been, I would suggest, no Western science, no Western progress, and no Western modernity. And so that's what Judaism has given to the West. Next is Jewish survival. Let's look at Jewish survival and what that can teach the West. Well, the Jews have had over the centuries a horrific attrition rate. We have lost countless numbers to persecution, to extermination, and to assimilation. Nevertheless, the Jewish people has survived persecution and pogroms and genocide. It's survived and thrived as a people, while every culture that's tried to destroy us has vanished. So how have the Jewish people done this? It's another long story, but in a nutshell, Judaism is all about promoting its own continuity and reinforcing its culture and its sense of itself as a nation. It understands the crucial point that the present must connect with the past in order to have a future. And it does this by telling a collective story about itself. It transmits this story through education, which has been a kind of sacred duty through the generations, through a web of custom and tradition, and through memorialization, both through celebrating the culture and through celebrating the achievements and memorializing its losses. Upon seeing the Jews observing the fast of Tisha B'Av, sitting on the floor and weeping, Napoleon reputedly said, "Any nation that still cries after 1,500 years is guaranteed to return." Now, What the Jews have embodied is a veneration of tradition which forms a kind of unbroken thread stretching from the past to the present and guaranteeing a future, because it cements succeeding generations into a culture they feel they share with their ancestors as a kind of sacred bond which they have to continue, to which they feel a deep sense of connection and obligation, and which creates in turn a strong sense of community and social bonds. No less important, the entire structure of religious observance in Judaism was built around the collective. While the individual was responsible for his or her own behavior, religious rituals were inseparable from nation building and forming a lasting community. And this meant a tremendous emphasis on the importance of having children and transmitting the culture to successive generations. The key to all this is the Jews' identification as a people. It's why diaspora Jews are disappearing, because they've lost that sense of themselves as a people, and why Israel is in such a very different situation. So why will Israel survive while at present the West will not? Well, in Israel, the birth rate is key. Women are having on average 3 to 4 babies per woman. In the West, they are literally dying out. The key point is that Israeli Jews understand themselves to belong to the nation state of the Jewish people, which makes sense of their existence. Israeli Jews know and value their ancient identity. They may not be religiously observant, but they feel part of an ancient tradition that is a religious one. And I think that the current terrible war has illustrated the real core of Israel's strength, because we've seen in example after example soldiers who have said, in terms, they are not just fighting to save their country from annihilation, which of course they are, but they're fighting for the survival of their people. They feel this is a sacred duty passed down from antiquity. They say they feel literally the spirits of all those Jews who died in generations past behind them and who kept the Jewish people alive through persecution and extermination. This sense of peoplehood creates meaning and purpose essential for national spirit. So in conclusion, I would say this. Now, I've got many more points that I could make, but time presses. I think that above all, what is the key point is what I would call Jewish peoplehood. And what Israel should be doing is telling both Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel and people in the West about the lessons to be learned from this. That in order for a culture to survive, you've got to love what it is, and you've got to value what it is. And there's plenty in the West to value and to love. Unfortunately, the West has told itself there's nothing to value or to love. And that's the way a culture dies. The Jewish people keep the culture alive because they love it. They revere it. They think it's good for you as an individual, they think it's good for you as a community, they think it's good in terms of producing values which are invaluable because they're so civilized. Israel should be telling the West not just that Israel is fighting the West's war against an Islamic death cult, it should be giving the West the cultural weapons to fight their own death cult, the West's own death cult, the West's apparent embrace of cultural suicide. Israel's lesson to the West is that the nation is not the route to nationalism and fascism. It is, in fact, essential to defend freedom and democracy and the core values of your society. You do this through education, through prioritizing the traditional family, to prioritizing the nation itself. My final conclusion is this. Israel, I think we can see, is currently, through this war and how it will develop, I don't know. But it certainly has the potential to reshape the geopolitical architecture of the region and world politics for the better. And what I'm suggesting is that Israel and the Jewish people can also reshape now the cultural architecture of the West. I said at the start that we can only understand the attack on Jews by the attack by the West on itself, and we can only understand the attack on the West by the West on itself if we understand that at the root of that is its attack on Judaism. Turn this on its head. Western civilization can only be saved by nurturing and defending Israel, Judaism, and the Jewish people. And for that to happen, we have to start educating ourselves. We have to start telling ourselves as Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, is that the message that we can give the West is that a culture that understands and values what it is will live, and Israel wants to live. Israel chooses life, while a culture that despises itself and wants to erase its particular and historic identity will die. And that is, I think, a lesson of the most immense value that we can give to the West. It doesn't want to hear it, doesn't understand it needs to hear it. Many Jews need to hear it as well. They need to understand. Those Jews who try to wrap themselves in the universalism of the West, both in the diaspora and here in Israel, need to understand that they are therefore wrapping themselves in a culture that is self-destructive and will destroy itself. Whereas the culture they should wrap themselves in is Jewish peoplehood, in which case they will choose life, as we all have here. Thank you.